விழிவலையொலியோடு இணைந்திருக்க இப்போதே விழிவலையொலி தளத்தை சப்ஸ்கிரைப் செய்யுங்கள்.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the 12th meeting of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now resume the interactive dialogue on the written update of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela for video statement. Please.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. The Council resolution which gave rise to the written update does not have the consent of Sri Lanka. This creates a dangerous precedent requiring the office to collect criminal evidence for future prosecutions, a mandate which was not given it by Resolution 48148 of the General Assembly, which established its mandate. Sri Lanka has demonstrated its seriousness, commitment and cooperation with this Council, its mechanisms, the treaty bodies and the Office. We welcome great steps forward made by Sri Lanka in the enjoyment of human rights since the return of peace in 2009 and significant achievements in the reconstruction and post-conflict reconciliation. The rehabilitation and returning to life in society for more than 12,000 ex-combatants demonstrates the humanist character of its government. Persons from all areas of life affected by the conflict are fully involved in democratic processes and the development of the country. Venezuela rejects any interference in the domestic processes of Sri Lanka as it moves towards a definitive national reconciliation. This Council must continue to support the efforts of Sri Lanka and its dignified people on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation, which ought to guide its work. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nigeria welcomes the government of commends the government of Sri Lanka for its genuine cooperation and constructive engagement with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other human rights mechanisms. We take positive note of the efforts of Sri Lanka to fulfill its international human rights obligations and deepen cooperation in the field of human rights, particularly in its commitment to the Human Rights Council. My delegation would like to again reiterate that the Human Rights Council was established to promote and protect human rights through cooperation and genuine dialogue to strengthen the capacity of member states to comply with their human rights obligations. In this regard, it is fundamentally imperative that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights ensures that implementation and execution of its mandate is at par with the spirit, tenor, and letter of its founding resolution GA 6251. Needless to say that the sovereignty of Sri Lanka and indeed all member states can only be guaranteed by upholding the principles of universality, objectivity and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues, as well as the elimination of double standards and politicization in this esteemed council. Finally, we commend the government of Sri Lanka on its efforts to strengthen the country's legal frameworks in the field of human rights and call on all member states to support the exertion of this country in the fulfillment of its international human rights obligations. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative or to delegation of Maldives, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives takes note of High Commissioner's report and her oral remarks. Sri Lanka is a very close friend and neighbor of the Maldives. We have always been supportive of Sri Lanka's efforts and progress in overcoming the challenges related to the development of the country. We believe that the country is well positioned to find solutions within its democratic processes. We appreciate the contribution provided by the international community to assist Sri Lanka to pursue its human rights agenda. We are confident that the government of Sri Lanka will continue to engage with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, and its mechanisms in good faith and in accordance with their national priorities to realize the aspirations of Sri Lankan people. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China for video statement, please.
Mr. President. As a friendly neighbor of Sri Lanka, China sincerely hopes its political stability, national solidarity, and unity will be maintained. China commends the government for actively promoting and protecting human rights and making notable progress in promoting sustainable economic and social development. We also appreciate the important achievements made in promoting reconciliation and reconstruction. In this regard, HRC Resolution 46/1 is not in line with the principles of impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization, nor has it been endorsed by the country concerned. Therefore, it will only hinder the promotion and protection of human rights and national reconciliation in Sri Lanka. We call on relevant parties to respect Sri Lanka's sovereignty, political independence, and the path of human rights development of their own choice in light of their national conditions, to engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation, and to stop politicizing human rights issues or using human rights as a pretext to interfere in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the delegation of Cuba for video statement.
Thank you, President. The Human Rights Council must make a priority of cooperation and constructive dialogue, and a mechanism which is universal, such as the UPR, to make sure that it does not have a selective approach to human rights. This exercise is not something that enjoys the support of the country concerned. We ought to be aware that any mandate of this kind will only contribute to double standards and politicization, which have begun to dominate this body, and will in no way promote the enjoyment of human rights. Cooperation, dialogue, and a respectful exchange on the basis of the UN Charter principles are the path to follow to ensure the effective promotion and enjoyment of human rights. Cuba has defended and will continue to defend these principles. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Mr. Chair, my country would like to welcome the measures taken by Sri Lanka in order to promote human rights, such as establishing the National Unity and Reconciliation Office, which is working now on charting a long-term strategic plan in order to achieve recovery and building peace. We reiterate our position, which is opposed to resolutions targeting countries in a specific situation. We think that we consider that paragraph 6 of resolution 46/1 should focus on capacity building in Sri Lanka and not to turn the OHCHR into an investigative body under the pretext of gathering evidence. We reiterate the importance of the Human Rights Council to take any decisions based on objective evidence based on truth, namely the information submitted by the concerned country, in order to prevent further gaps and polarization inside the Human Rights Council. The Council should deal with human rights issues through a transparent dialogue with the legitimate government of Sri Lanka, while respecting its constitution, its legal framework, and to support its efforts to support its own citizens and to build peace. Thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan for video statement.
Thank you. Japan takes note of both High Commissioner's report and Sri Lanka's observations on it. Japan considers that further efforts are required to achieve national reconciliation and a better human rights situation in Sri Lanka. At the same time, Japan believes that to do so, it is vital that Sri Lanka takes voluntary actions and provide remedies. In this regard, Japan appreciates Sri Lanka initiatives including the recent cabinet approval of amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which enable access to the lawyers and judicial appeal. Japan also values the Sri Lanka government's engagement with the civil society towards reconciliation with the minorities. Japan sincerely hopes that Sri Lanka will continue to make further efforts to improve its human rights situation, and that the international community, including OHCHR, will encourage Sri Lanka to do so. Japan will also continue to support Sri Lanka's efforts to promote reconciliation and improve the human rights situation in the country, including through the construction of infrastructure, community development, demining activities, and judicial training. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I invite the delegation of Ethiopia. Please, the floor is yours. Ethiopia once more. Okay. Ethiopia is absent right now. Now I give the floor to the delegation of the Vietnam for video statement.
Mr. President, Vietnam acknowledges Sri Lanka's strong commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights in line with the country's constitution and international obligations. We welcome the progress made by Sri Lanka on the implementation of voluntary commitments since the 46th session of the Human Rights Council, despite severe challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also commend Sri Lanka for the strengthening of national unity and reconciliation through legislative reform, as well as through coordinated measures for resettling internationally displaced persons, accounting of missing persons, land release, and various forms of reparations for victims of the past conflicts. Sri Lanka has also made encouraging headway on the implementation of the SDGs. We hope the Council and international partners will continue enhancing constructive dialogue, technical cooperation, and capacity building in Sri Lanka for strong recovery from COVID-19 pandemic and realizing of SDGs in the country that better enabling the enjoyment of human rights by the people of Sri Lanka. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. Je donne la parole à la délégation.
I recognize the delegation of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice-président.
Vice President, Switzerland wishes to thank Madam High Commissioner for her report. We take note of recent efforts made by the government of Sri Lanka in the human rights sector and in reconciliation. Nevertheless, we regret the lack of progress on some areas of the Commissioner's report. To make sure that national reconciliation is successful, we have sadly not seen any progress in terms of accountability, and impunity continues. The work of the High Commissioner is essential in order to assess the extent of international crimes. For more than 40 years, the law on the prevention of terrorism is in contradiction with the prohibition of torture and arbitrary detention, and it unjustifiably limits the rights of civilians. The amendments proposed do not affect the most problematic provisions of the law. The Commission on Human Rights of Sri Lanka is in danger, and civil space is all the more limited. We welcome the fact that Sri Lanka is considering financial compensation for the families of victims of enforced disappearances, but this does not replace the quest for truth in building a lasting peace. We can recommend the government of Sri Lanka to fully implement the recommendations of the High Commissioner's report and all of the Council's recommendations on the situation in Sri Lanka. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
The distinguished representative of Cambodia for video statement.
Mr. President, Cambodia welcomes Sri Lanka active engagements with various mandate holders and constructive cooperation with wide-ranging international organizations and UN agencies in promoting compliance with its international human rights obligations. We commend the government continued efforts to enhance the socio-economic well-being of all its people in achieving the SDG by 2030, as well as reconciliation, including by offering support to families of missing persons through the Office of Missing Persons and the Office of Reparations. The High Commissioner report and this Council deliberation should acknowledge these positive attributes. All human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social, including the right to development, are organically interlinked and mutually reinforcing. They must be treated in a fair and equal manner on the same footing and with the same emphasis. Mr. President, human rights agenda must be discussed through a genuine dialogue-based approach with non-confrontation, non-politicization, and non-selectivity, based on verified source of information, bearing in mind the national particularities and priorities of each country. The enduring strength of all human rights mechanism lies in even-handed approach with transparency, objectivity, and impartiality, as well as in full adherence to the principle of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and non-interference, which are well enshrined in the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation, please.
Господин председатель.
President, we note the Sri Lankan authorities' attempts to improve the human rights situation in the country. Since 2021, there's been a presidential commission to investigate violations, and it has made considerable progress in national reconciliation with an operational office on disparate persons and an office on compensation. The former war zones are now being cleared of UXO, and there is progress on return of IDPs to their homes. Infrastructure is being built in areas with many Tamil populations. There are also measures to improve the legislation, in particular the law to prevent terrorism, in order to bring it into line with international standards. We note the increase in readiness by Sri Lanka to conduct respectful cooperation with the international human rights mechanisms, but within such cooperation, Sri Lanka must itself, without any external influence, determine priorities and activities, as well as the areas that require international assistance. Only in that case will the measures taken be truly effective and foster a strengthening of promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Thank you.
Благодарю.
Thank you.
Now I invite the delegation of Australia for video statement, please.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your comprehensive update. Australia is a long-standing partner of Sri Lanka in its reconciliation efforts. We are committed to supporting Sri Lanka through constructive and practical engagement to implement transitional justice commitments and international human rights obligations. We encourage Sri Lanka's continued engagement with the Human Rights Council and its special procedures and welcome the invitation for the High Commissioner to visit. We recognise the High Commissioner's concerns regarding the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, including surveillance and intimidation of civil society, differential treatment of minority communities, respect for the rule of law, including in relation to recent high-profile cases, and continuing reports of torture and ill treatment by law enforcement officials. We note Sri Lanka's commitment to continue measures of peace-building, reparation and development, and encourage the ongoing and independent operation of domestic reconciliation mechanisms. We recognise recent releases on bail under the Prevention of Torture Act and encourage Sri Lanka to continue efforts to ensure its legal framework is in line with international human rights standards. We encourage Sri Lanka to continue to work with your office, including to take forward recommendations of Council Resolution 46.1 on promoting reconciliation, accountability and human rights. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon for Zoom, as I understood.
سيد الرئيس، المفوضة السامية على تقريرها وإحاطتها.
We wish to thank the High Commissioner for her report and thank the delegation of Sri Lanka for the update we've been given, and we would encourage them to continue cooperating with the Office of the High Commissioner. We have the following remarks. We welcome the progress made in Sri Lanka to put an end to the conflict and rebuild the country and ensure reconciliation. The interpreters point out the sound quality is very poor. There is not possible for interpretation.
90% من الأراضي التي كانت تستخدم لأغراض عسكرية خلال النزاع المسلح الذي عصف بالبلاد. وفي هذا الإطار يسمن لبنان المبادرات التي تخول أهالي المناطق التي تأثرت بالحرب المشاركة بالمسار الديمقراطي والتنموي للبلاد. في الختام يدعو لبنان المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان والمجتمع الدولي إلى مواكبة.
Please, the delegation, maybe it's some technical problem, maybe could you speak a little bit slowly, please, for translation and interpretation, please.
Do I repeat statement?
You can repeat, yes.
سيد الرئيس، يشكر لبنان المفوضة السامية.
Lebanon wishes to thank Madam High Commissioner for her report and for the information which has been provided to the Council. We also wish to thank the delegation of Sri Lanka and would urge them to continue their cooperation with OHCHR. Lebanon welcomes the progress in Sri Lanka since the end of the conflict, and we welcome the reconciliation and reconstruction process and efforts made to return ex-combatants to society. Lebanon welcomes efforts to settle domestic disputes and to move ahead with legislative reform. We note the efforts made to help local communities that suffered so greatly in the conflict and assist them to play a full part in the rebuilding of the country. We would urge the international community to support efforts made by Sri Lanka with no selectivity and no double standards. And the interpreters point out the sound was still very poor.
Of Uganda for statement by Zoom, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to thank the High Commissioner for the report on human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Uganda recognizes that the progress has been made towards promoting reconciliation and accountability in line with Resolution 46.1 and welcomes the efforts of the government of Sri Lanka in that regard. The voluntary commitments that were made by the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, Professor Perez, at the 48th HRC session demonstrate the government of Sri Lanka's commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights for her people. Mr. Vice President, we believe that the role of Human Rights Council mechanisms in the protection of human rights within states should remain supportive to the national processes which are designed to take into account the peculiar historical and social circumstances of concerned states. It's therefore important to ensure that such interventions are made with compliance with international human rights law and cooperation with the relevant authorities of the concerned states. We encourage the government of Sri Lanka to continue with its national efforts to protect the human rights of the people of Sri Lanka. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus for video statement.
Thank you. HRC Resolution 46.1 and the information provided by OHCHR are another deplorable example of how a particular group of Western states cynically manipulates the work of the Council and the Office. We're seeing how OHCHR is being turned into a controlled mechanism to implement political strategies of the West towards specific UN member states. These strategies are reinforced by the promotion in the HRC and with the support of OHCHR of the concept of accountability for human rights violations within universal jurisdiction for inter alia, justifying introducing unlawful Western sanctions against UN member states. OHCHR is being made to look like an externally controlled investigation. The information provided by OHCHR for this session on Sri Lanka and Belarus is a clear example of the implementation of this concept. In this connection, we stress that we do not believe a single word by OHCHR and call on it to return to its mandate as defined in UNGA Resolution 48/141 and strictly observe the principle of neutrality in its activities. We have to discuss the situation of Sri Lanka, and this should not be on the agenda of the Human Rights Council at all. We commend the government of Sri Lanka for its success in post-war reconstruction and reconciliation, and for further improving the standards of living of its people. We call on the Council to engage in mutually respectful dialogue with Sri Lanka and reject politically motivated decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite the delegation of Zimbabwe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Zimbabwe thanks the High Commissioner for her report. We wish to point out that the practice of imposition of country-specific mandates, especially without the consent of the country concerned, is counterproductive and runs counter to the principles of genuine dialogue and cooperation in human rights work. We also note that assigning the OHCHR the role of collecting criminal evidence for purposes of any future prosecutions is outside the mandate of the office. Since the end of the conflict in the country, Sri Lanka has scored significant achievements in the areas of post-war reconstruction, reconciliation, and protection of the rights of its people. In this regard, we call on the Council to constructively assist Sri Lanka to further enhance its ongoing domestic processes in these and other areas. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States of America.
Thank you to the High Commissioner. The United States welcomes Sri Lanka's efforts to amend the Prevention of Terrorism Act and its recent release of more than 40 individuals, many of whom were held for years without charge. We welcome the move of the NGO Secretariat of the Ministry of Defense and initial steps to engage with some civil society representatives. We hope to see continued progress. We urge the government to take further steps to bring PTA reforms into alignment with international human rights law and encourage them to ensure all Sri Lankans have access to justice and can exercise freedom of expression. We call on the government to cease its harassment of civil society, human rights defenders, and journalists. To foster reconciliation, the Office on Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations should operate effectively, independently, transparently, and in a victim-centric manner. We also call on the government to engage with Tamil and Muslim parties and civil society organizations to advance an inclusive, lasting political solution. What actions can we take this year to advance human rights, including religious freedom, justice, accountability, and reconciliation? Thank you.
I thank you. I invite the delegation of Eritrea to give the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, Eritrea takes note of the report of High Commissioner and has the following comments on the report and methodologies. It's an established international principles that promotion of human rights is essential in relation to the intrinsic obligation attached to the ideals of humanity in which all nations share collective responsibility. In this vein, Eritrea has always advocated for dialogue and cooperation as the best solutions and way forward on the promotion and protection of human rights. Like any other state, Sri Lanka also faces challenges and problems in all areas of developmental sectors, including in the human rights domain. However, Sri Lanka has demonstrated responsibility to promote and protect human rights in accordance to the context, needs, and human betterment ideals of the Sri Lankan people. The resettlement and distribution of the vast majority of the land to the needy and the release of former combatants from prison are notable progresses that lay the groundwork for lasting and durable peace in Sri Lanka. Mr. Vice President, dignified engagements and cooperation predicted on mutual respect and understanding based on national priorities can deliver best. On its part, Sri Lanka has been engaged and cooperated through the UPR and also co-sponsored Resolution 40/1 to address its challenges. However, accountability can be best served by encouraging and building institutions of Sri Lanka and not by excluding them. Eritrea is on belief that its own experience that the targeting of any country through establishing a mandate without the consent of the concerned state is counterproductive both for the subject and the state. The UPR and other relevant mechanisms have proved much success as opposed to specific mechanisms. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I invite the delegation of North Macedonia to take the floor.
President, we thank the High Commissioner for her update on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. North Macedonia aligns itself with the statement of the United Kingdom on behalf of the core group. In our national capacity, I would like to add that we call upon the authorities to intensify their efforts towards promotion of reconciliation and protection of all human rights in Sri Lanka. Accountability is a key for reconciliation and lasting peace. Therefore, we reiterate the need for Sri Lanka to put in place a transparent process for prosecution of international crimes and serious human rights violations, as well as pursuing an effective transitional justice process. In this regard, undertaking an independent investigation for those responsible of enforced disappearances and providing comprehensive reparation to the families of the disappeared is of utmost importance. Mr. President, we recognize the openness of the Sri Lankan government to the work of the Office of the High Commissioner and the special procedures. We encourage the authorities to continue to engage with the Office of the High Commissioner and with the UN Human Rights Council and its mechanism regarding Resolution 46/1 in a constructive manner. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Sudan. Okay. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen for video statement.
السيد الرئيس استمعنا إلى تقرير المفوضية السامية.
President, we have listened with interest to the High Commissioner's statement on Sri Lanka. We reiterate the importance of cooperating with that country, taking into account the government's efforts in order to ensure the economic, social and other forms of stability and help that country overcome human rights violations, which it is doing through its presidential commission. It is possible to provide support to the National Human Rights Commission so that it may carry out its task. we reiterate the importance of positive cooperation, and we welcome the cooperation provided by the government of Sri Lanka. This deserves to continue. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Islamic Republic of Iran commends the achievements have been made by the Sri Lanka in recent years and for its cooperation and engagement with OSCHR, showing determination to promote and protect human rights of its people. Mr. Vice President, the resolution 16/251 upholds the need for genuine dialogue and cooperation. The UN human rights bodies and mechanisms should support governments upon their consent in implementing their obligation under applicable international human rights law and should not assume roles that go behind their mandate as stated in resolution 48/141 and 16/251. The OSCHR and the Council need to cooperate and support the state based on neutral, independent, and impartial approach in order to safeguard human rights from politicization and double standards, and should refrain from speculation in addressing the human rights development of states. Mr. Vice President, the OSCHR and the authorities are encouraged to enhance their constructive cooperation and comprehensive approaches, taking into account the concern of concerned states to overcome the challenges and mitigate the consequences in order to enhance the promotion and protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. Now I invite the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. It's Zoom, as I understand.
Mr. Vice President, the Lao PDR take note of the update on the recent development in Sri Lanka by the OSCHR. My delegation commends Sri Lanka for its continued and constructive cooperation with the OSCHR, as well as its achievements made in the achieving the rights and fundamental freedom of its people. We are of the view that country-specific initiatives are confrontational and run counter to the fundamental principles prescribed in the resolution 60/251. We therefore would like to emphasize that the work of the HRC shall be guided by the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, and constructive international dialogue and cooperation. We also encourage the OSCHR and international community to constructively support Sri Lanka to advance their efforts for promotion and protection of human rights, reconciliation, and development on the basis of domestic priorities. I thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger. Please, the floor is yours. Niger, the floor is yours. Niger is absent. Okay, I invite the delegation of Kazakhstan to give the floor.
Mr. President, my delegation has carefully studied the High Commissioner's report and oral remarks, as well as information provided by the government of Sri Lanka. Kazakhstan supports the comprehensive efforts of the government of Sri Lanka aimed at protecting and promoting human rights and freedoms. We also welcome goodwill and actions by Colombo to fulfill its international obligations in the field of human rights, interacting with mechanisms of the UN system. At the same time, we call upon Sri Lanka to further cooperate and positively engage with the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bangladesh appreciates the constructive engagement of the government of Sri Lanka with the OHCHR throughout the preparation of the OHCHR report. We value the work and contribution of the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms towards the universal respect of human rights. We underline that genuine dialogue and cooperation are necessary for promoting and protecting human rights everywhere. Mr. Vice President, like many other developing countries, Sri Lanka is severely affected by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on public health and economic and social rights. We underline that Sri Lanka needs international cooperation and support in its effort for promoting peace, reconciliation, and human rights. As a friendly country, Bangladesh wishes Sri Lanka every success in its efforts to achieve sustainable peace and reconciliation in the country while promoting and protecting human rights. We request the OHCHR to enhance dialogue and cooperation with Sri Lanka, including through technical cooperation in accordance with the principles of impartiality and non-selectivity. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the representative of Azerbaijan, please.
Mr. Vice President, Azerbaijan takes note of the report submitted by the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for the current ID and information provided by Sri Lanka as a concerned country. We would like to emphasize that all matters falling within the domestic jurisdiction of UN member states, including that of Sri Lanka, must be resolved through dialogue and cooperation based on respect of the rule of law, independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and inviolability of international borders of states. We believe that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights should favor constructive dialogue and cooperation with the government of Sri Lanka and provide it with necessary advisory services, technical and financial assistance upon its request to support the government's actions and programs in ensuring human rights in Sri Lanka. I thank you.
I thank you. I thank you. I would like to invite the delegation of Niger to give the floor by Zoom.
Thank you, President. The sound, unfortunately, is very bad. The speaker cannot be heard properly. My delegation thanks the High Commissioner for her report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka and commends the Sri Lankan authorities' cooperation in drawing up the report. We also welcome the government's cooperation with the human rights mechanisms as seen by the 2020 agreement and the visit of mandate holders under the special procedures, in particular on the right to education and the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. We note the progress made by Sri Lanka to promote and protect human rights, including unfortunately, the speaker cannot be heard properly. The return of property and the return of IDPs, as well as national reconciliation. In conclusion, we encourage Sri Lanka to continue its efforts to work with the Office of the High Commissioner and human rights mechanisms and call on the international community to support that country as it implements its voluntary commitments to promote and protect human rights. Thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom welcomes the update from Madam High Commissioner. We share the High Commissioner's concerns regarding the continued lack of progress on accountability and regret there has been setbacks in several emblematic human rights cases. We welcome recent releases on bail of Anaf Ajazim and Hijaz Hizbullah as a positive first step. Whilst we acknowledge initial reforms of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, these do not go far enough. Whilst we acknowledge the NGO Secretariat move to the Foreign Ministry, we have concerns around surveillance and harassment of civil society and militarisation of civilian governmental functions. The appointment of an individual named in key emblematic case to the post of provincial governor is particularly worrying. Whilst we acknowledge ongoing work in government institutions on reparations and missing persons, it is crucial this is accompanied by a comprehensive reconciliation and accountability process. We note with concern that minority communities are facing increased marginalisation with allegations of land grabs in the north and east of the country. We call on the Government of Sri Lanka to engage constructively with the recommendations in Resolution 46/1 and to cooperate with your office. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I give the floor to the distinguished Ambassador of Pakistan to give the floor, please.
Thank you, Vice President. We take note of the High Commissioner's written update as well as Sri Lanka's comments on it. We appreciate Sri Lanka's continuing engagement with the Council, OHCHR, and national stakeholders. This is particularly noteworthy given its rejection of Resolution 46/1 and its legitimate concerns over aspects of the OHCHR mandate. We recognize the progress made by Sri Lanka and encourage it to build on its domestic processes on reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. We commend Sri Lanka for achieving high vaccination rates and providing economic support measures despite the financial and fiscal crunch induced by COVID-19. We share concerns over micromanagement of Sri Lanka's internal constitutional and governance matters. We underscore the imperative of strict adherence to the provisions of UN Charter, UNGA Resolution 60/251 and the IB package. We are encouraged by Sri Lanka's willingness to consider inputs from national and international partners. We applaud Sri Lanka's achievements against terrorism perpetrated by LTTE and sponsored from abroad. We call for provision of justice to victims of this terrorism and accountability of both its perpetrators and external sponsors. Sri Lanka's constructive posture provides space for meaningful engagement and collaboration. We hope this Council and its allied mechanisms will duly consider Sri Lanka's cooperation, views and concerns as the country concerned. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia by Zoom, please.
Thank you.
Sorry, the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia notes with appreciation the commitment and significant effort made by Sri Lanka in making real strides in human rights, as well as its engagement with the OHCHR, despite the many challenges it is facing. Ethiopia has always stressed on the importance of abiding by the principles of universality, impartiality, and neutrality. The primary responsibility to promote and protect human rights rests with the individual country. As a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Council must live up to the values and fundamental principles enshrined in the Charter and Resolution 60/251, which calls for the sovereign equality and respect for agreed international rules, fundamentals which we must work for all. In this connection, we are of the view that OHCHR should pay more attention to the efforts of the country concerned on the ground and take on board authoritative information rather than impeding national processes aimed at promoting human rights and national reconciliation. As no country is perfect in advancing human rights flawlessly, we believe the best way is to remain within the framework of dialogue based on the long-standing commitment of the country, building on the achievements in the areas of its cooperation with the UN Special Procedure mandate holders and resettlement of IDPs. In conclusion, Ethiopia renews its objection of the politicization of human rights and mandates specific resolution without the agreement of the country concerned. I thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Sudan. In the room or by Zoom. As I understood, the delegation of South Sudan is absent right now. Okay, we shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to the representative of Hiam Rehabilitation Center for Victims of Torture. Please, the floor is yours.
Two key issues that are indicative of the overall deterioration of human rights in Sri Lanka. My parliamentary colleague Ranjan Ramanayake was sentenced as much as 4 years and his civic rights removed and imprisonment for alleged contempt of court, which is not an offence defined in the law and had no right to appeal. The President has ignored requests, including from International Parliamentary Union, to pardon Ramanayake so that he could resume his political work. The cries of the victims of the Easter Sunday bombing and the truth and justice continue to be in vain. The non-prosecution and the negligence of high officials give rise to the suspicion that the real brains behind the attacks are being shielded. Instead, the investigator Shani Besekar dubbed as Sherlock Holmes of Sri Lanka and senior police officer Ravi Seniratna are being hounded and their lives are in danger. The government is reluctant to make meaningful changes to the draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, which facilitate arbitrary detention, torture, conviction, based on solely on alleged confessions. Citizens exercising their freedom of expression has been harassed. Civil society activists work under severe pressure. Militarization of civil administration is a characteristic of this government. Ethnic and religious minorities live in anxiety. Added to all this, the economic mismanagement, severe shortage of essential items, disruption of electricity supply, long queues of fuel, are soaring cost of living is just of its consequences. As I speak today, the main opposition office also was attacked by a government member. I urge the international community to support people of Sri Lanka whose human rights been threatened than ever before. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for her update on Sri Lanka, sharing concerns on regressing human rights situation, including the erosion of the independence of the judiciary. The Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka is due to be downgraded from A status for its lack of independence, effectiveness, and diversity. As a proposed amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act lacks safeguards against arbitrary detention, torture, and other human rights abuses, a moratorium must be established on its use until necessary legislation is introduced. The government is deploying a smear campaign against those working for truth, justice, accountability, reconciliation, and human rights. We are troubled by the recent Foreign Ministry's statement against Ambika Saknathathan for providing expert opinion to the European Parliament. The arrest of Serhan Malik Gamal reminded us of the white band abductions used for suppression of dissent. We align ourselves with the statement of the Inter-Parliamentary Union regarding former MP Ranjan Ramanayake. The government is increasingly militarized and the culture of impunity is still prevailing. The campaign One Country, One Law is relying on extreme Buddhist ideology for electoral gains. The Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act and other personal laws must be reformed in consultation with the women affected. The government has failed to propose a sustainable solution to enormous economic hardships faced by its citizens. Madam High Commissioner, what can the international community do to address accountability and abuse of executive power, undermining democracy and the rule of law? Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Franciscan International.
Your Excellency, dear ladies and gentlemen, the Easter Sunday suicide bomb attacks in Sri Lanka on 21st April 2019 claimed the lives of 269 persons, including 82 children and 47 foreign nationals belonging to 14 nations, and injured more than 500 others. The first impression of this massacre was that it was purely the work of a few Islamic extremists. However, subsequent investigations indicate that this massacre was part of a grand political plot. Despite our repeated requests and those of civil organizations pursuing the truth, the incumbent government of Sri Lanka has failed to mete out justice to the victims. Instead of uncovering the truth behind the attack and prosecuting those responsible, there are attempts to harass and intimidate those who clamor for justice. As a result, nearly 3 years after the horrendous crime, we are still in the dark as to what really happened on that Easter Sunday. As this is a case of a serious violation of the fundamental rights of the aggrieved victims, we earnestly call upon the UNHRC and all its member countries to support the continuation of evidence gathering initiated by the Council last year and to devise a means to ensure an impartial investigation to unravel the truth behind the Easter Sunday massacre. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite the representative of Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development to give the floor, please.
We welcome the High Commissioner's written update. We remain concerned at the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, which stands in stark contrast to the government's narrative of supposed improvements and reforms. Harassment, intimidation, and surveillance of human rights defenders, civil society victims, and their families continue to intensify. The Terrorism Investigation Division regularly targets NGOs and their staff in clear attempts to intimidate and silence them. Those campaigning for credible investigations and accountability for 2019 Easter attacks continue to face harassment. The proposed amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, at the core of the government's narrative of purported reforms, are cosmetic and insufficient to address serious concerns with the law and its implementation. We call for an immediate moratorium on the use of the law. The appointment of a presidential task force to implement the concept of one country, one law is another blatant attempt at perpetuating discrimination against minorities for political gain. The government continues to obstruct accountability through political interference. The current economic crisis caused by the mismanagement of the economy and the COVID-19 pandemic has deepened the human rights crisis and widened the inequality gap. The Council must not be distracted by superficial gestures of reform and engagement aimed at warding off international criticism. In absence of tangible progress, the Council must be prepared to take further action to advance accountability, including by strengthening and supporting the OHCHR capacity to collect and preserve evidence. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of International Harm Reduction Association. Please.
Mr. President, we reiterate the broad range of serious human rights concerns in Sri Lanka highlighted by the High Commissioner, including ongoing militarization. In line with this trend, we reiterate our concern about the militarization of drug control and treatment in the country and its negative repercussions on human rights as well as individual and public health. A worrying pattern of deaths in custody of persons arrested for drug offences in alleged shootouts with law enforcement or while assisting law enforcement operations have been documented. The lack of investigation into these custodial deaths entrenches impunity and the use of violence by state agencies. We highlight the existence of laws that contravene human rights standards, including by giving arbitrary powers to law enforcement and the judiciary to mandate people to drug rehabilitation. People detained in drug treatment centers, some of which are managed by the Sri Lanka Army, suffer physical and psychological violence, inhuman conditions of detention, and lack of evidence-based treatment. Mr. President, we urge the government of Sri Lanka to adopt a human rights and health-centered approach to drug policy, abide by a zero-tolerance policy on torture, investigate all deaths in custody, and ensure those found responsible are held accountable. We call upon the Office of the High Commissioner to conduct due diligence to ensure the engagement of all UN agencies on this issue is in accordance with human rights standards and to call upon donors who support programs in country to do the same and abide by the do no harm principle. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite the representative of International Commission of Jurists to give the floor.
The ICJ welcomes the OHCHR's wide-ranging report. We appreciate its recognition of the heavy militarization of civilian functions, including the widespread appointment of senior military figures into positions of administrative authority and the need for independence of the Attorney General's Department. In the past year, the human rights situation in Sri Lanka has only deteriorated further. The government's refusal to ensure accountability for crimes under international law and the release of several high-ranking military personnel suspected of such crimes indicate continued systematic impunity. Surveillance and harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and activists have increased. Impunity for cases of enforced disappearances and intimidation of the victims' families by security forces continue. Extrajudicial killings by police have sharply risen, and Tamil and Muslim prisoners have been particularly vulnerable to ill treatment and torture in detention, in one instance committed by a state minister. Cases of arbitrary detention have increased, and the PTA, despite calls for its repeal, continues to be used. The government's refusal to repeal the PTA and the continued impunity for violations of international law are illustrative of its general unwillingness to engage in real accountability measures. Madam High Commissioner, what further steps can OHCHR take to press the government to fulfill its commitments to accountability? Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Vivat International.
Vivat International welcomes the report of the High Commissioner on Sri Lanka and expresses her concern about the human rights situation, especially the lack of independent and democratic institutions, militarization of the country, reprisals against families of disappeared persons, and persecution of the human rights defenders. We draw special attention to the Easter Sunday attacks that took place in 2019 on several hotels and churches. This was the biggest post-war massacre that cost the lives of 269 persons, including 47 foreigners. 21 of the 22 volumes of the report of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry have not yet been made public, and the government has not taken all necessary steps to implement the significant recommendations that come from the only volume made public. We support the High Commissioner recommendations and urge all member states of the Human Rights Council to support the continuation of gathering of evidence of such crimes and abuses initiated by the Council last year, use universal jurisdiction for crimes committed in Sri Lanka, and establish an international independent tribunal for Sri Lanka, including the Easter Sunday attacks. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of World Evangelical Alliance. Please.
President, the World Evangelical Alliance welcomes the written update of the High Commissioner. Violence against religious minorities continues in Sri Lanka with impunity. We call on the government of Sri Lanka to hold accountable those who commit violence against religious minorities. We also call on the government to repeal bans on full face covering and cattle slaughter. We also urge the government of Sri Lanka to desist from mandating any form of registration of places of worship and to rescind the 2008 circular on prior permission for construction and registration of places of worship. This circular is currently misused to intimidate members of religious minorities. Finally, we are gravely concerned by the lack of political will to achieve justice for the victims of the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings, which killed 270 people, including at the Evangelical Zion Church on the island of Batikaloa and at Catholic churches. We echo the call of the High Commissioner to the government of Sri Lanka to publish the findings of the Commission of Inquiry into the Easter Sunday bombings and to pursue further independent investigation. And we ask the High Commissioner what additional and immediate steps she recommends that the government of Sri Lanka takes to ensure that justice is served for the Easter bombing victims. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, please.
Madam
President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada appreciates the OHCHR's report on Sri Lanka. We note the concerns about the continued lack of accountability for past human rights violations in Sri Lanka, the alarming trends toward majoritarianism that undermine democratic institutions, and the pattern of intimidation and threats towards human rights defenders and victims. As noted in the report, the government of Sri Lanka has failed to establish any credible pathways for transitional justice towards accountability and reconciliation. The families of the disappeared have faced extensive harassment and surveillance by security agents in efforts to hinder their access to truth, justice, and reparations. We have previously raised concerns about the arrest and detention of Hejaz Hezbollah, a lawyer and vocal advocate for the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka. While recently ordered released by the court, Mr. Hezbollah spent close to 2 years arbitrarily detained without trial under Sri Lanka's draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act. This case is a clear example of the need to repeal the PTA. We reiterate our calls upon the Council to seek the referral of the situation of Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court and urge member states to investigate and prosecute international crimes committed in Sri Lanka through domestic judicial proceedings utilizing the principles of universal jurisdiction. Thank you, Madam President.
I give the floor. Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International.
Mr. President, Amnesty International welcomes the OHCHR report highlighting the continued lack of accountability, the lack of recognition of victims' rights, and other trends that continue to impede reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Amnesty remains deeply concerned by the shrinking civic space and urges the government to halt reprisals against critics and perceived critics, including those advocating for justice for the tragic April 2019 bombings. Families of the disappeared continue to face obstacles and pushback from state agents while they demand their right to truth and justice, including through the state's pursuit of court orders attempting to restrict their freedom to protest. The state's alarming discrimination and targeting of the Muslim community continues unabated. Amnesty continues to call for an immediate moratorium on the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which continues to be used to detain hundreds, particularly minorities, for prolonged periods without charge or trial. Repeated attempts to amend the Act have proved futile, including the latest iteration of amendments that fail to address critical gaps in the law to bring it in line with international law. While we welcome court decisions to grant bail to selected PTA detainees, hundreds more still languish in detention without access to bail. Sri Lankan authorities must ensure that all those still detained have access to fair bail hearings and must release those not yet charged with recognisable crimes under international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'm informed that the delegation of South Sudan now is here. If there's no objections, I would like to invite the representative of South Sudan to give the floor. If there's no objections.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Please, South Sudan.
Updates by the OHCHR on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, and would like to thank the government of Sri Lanka for its continued cooperation with human rights mechanisms. It is necessary to point out that the needed construction dialogue in the area of promotion and protection of human rights must always be within the consent of the country concerned. Any attempt of such adversarial initiatives which are inconsistent with the founding documents of this Council will only and always create impediments to advancing human rights goals. By doing so, the OHCR should not assume roles beyond its mandates and stated resolutions as stated in Resolution 48/141. South Sudan commends the significant achievements made by Sri Lanka in the post-war reconstructions and reconciliation, guided by efforts of the opening up of the former conflict-affected areas to fully participate in democratic processes in the country, including creating conducive environment for the safe return and resettlement of the displaced persons. We welcome the progress achieved and call on Human Rights Council to cooperate with Sri Lanka at this juncture with the aim of promoting programs geared towards reconciliations and development in the country. Thank you.
I thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate for this dialogue. Now I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, for her concluding remarks. Please, Excellency, the floor is yours.
Chair, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, delegates. I'd like to take a few of the queries that came up. Let me start with a question posed by Canada, the Netherlands, on behalf of Benelux, the United States, the NGO IMADR, and the International Commission of Jurists regarding the advancement of justice, accountability, and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. The High Commissioner believes that the first and most important thing is to actually continue this level of engagement by the Human Rights Council. To the extent that we see the government of Sri Lanka becoming more responsive and taking these initial steps, regular reporting and discussions like this in the Council constitute an important incentive for action. The Council has also elaborated very important recommendations and benchmarks over the years, and it is important that the monitoring and follow-up are maintained. With respect to accountability, because Sri Lankan domestic processes have repeatedly failed to deliver justice, the High Commissioner's reports have already elaborated a menu of options that can be pursued, including at the international level. These are not exclusive, they can be combined. Some accountability measures, judicial and other, are open to the use by member states within their own jurisdiction. We have already seen a number of cases in which Sri Lankan perpetrators from various sides have faced different forms of jurisdiction, including universal. Another option, of course, includes applying targeted individual sanctions to credibly alleged perpetrators of serious crimes. These should be considered for all parties responsible, both state and non-state actors. And there are examples of Sri Lankans being subject to travel bans. Some Sri Lankan personnel have also been excluded from UN peacekeeping through very strict vetting procedures. And while sanctions, even targeted, are important symbolically, they can also lead to a sense of justice for victims and their families. On reconciliation, let me say the international community can help to support civil society initiatives in particular aimed at reconciliation and peace building, also by providing practical benefits for victims of those violations, by prioritizing them, for example, in development programs, through small business loans, education scholarships, and so on. This is especially important for the families of the disappeared, many of whom are now female-headed households who are in a very precarious economic situation. The United States raised the issue of religious freedom. We are concerned about the intrusion of more extremist brands of religious and nationalist discourse in Sri Lanka. It's therefore really important to continue to support interfaith dialogue and initiatives among religious leaders and communities that promote, cement social cohesion and peace building with the aim of ending hate speech and intolerance. The one country, one law concept promoted by the government should not be at the expense of Sri Lanka's religious diversity and rich pluralist identity. The World Evangelical Alliance asked regarding justice being served for the Easter bombing victims. I note in particular the statement made by Catholic Cardinal Ranjith to the Council just a few minutes ago, highlighting the inadequacy of the investigations that have been carried out to date. While some people are now being prosecuted for their association with the attacks, victims have demanded that the government publish a full account of the circumstances that permitted those attacks, in particular the role of the security establishment. I note that additional evidence from the Presidential Commission of Inquiry into the attacks has now been shared with Parliament. Publishing the complete findings of the Commission of Inquiry into the bombings is essential to ensure transparency for victims and also to pursue further independent investigations into the involvement of any other state or non-state actors. The Philippines and Bangladesh inquired about the opportunities for collaborative technical cooperation between Sri Lanka and the UN in areas such as counterterrorism, civic space, and accountability. We have engaged with Sri Lanka for many years through the deployment of a senior human rights advisor and a local team who continue to provide technical support in many areas. Under past resolutions of this Council, the Office has indeed supported many of the transitional justice mechanisms and national human rights institutions. Many also of the special procedures who have visited Sri Lanka have offered advice and recommendations or provided conduits to technical assistance. And this remains, of course, available, as well as advice to the government in implementing all the recommendations that come from our office and the human rights mechanisms, including on counterterrorism laws, civic space, and accountability to ensure compliance with international legal obligations. Vietnam had a question about support of the UN to the development approach and the SDGs. We note the commitments made by the government to the SD agenda. This should remain an important focus for UN engagement and support. I'd just like to note that the 2030 agenda also includes Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Hence, our concern that the erosion of independent institutions, notably the obstruction of the judiciary, and continuing impunity for violations will therefore undermine the long-term proposed lasting effects, particularly the pursuit of peace and stability within the SDG framework. These require independence also, the police structures, as well as the judiciary, as I mentioned, without political interference and the end of all institutionalized impunity. The 2030 agenda puts forward an inclusive vision in order to leave no one behind, where there is no place for rhetoric or hate speech towards minority communities. These are areas of common commitment for the entire UN, very much in partnership with the government. I think that was it. I will stop there. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
I thank you, Excellency. This brings us to the end of the interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the Deputy High Commissioner for her participation. We will now take a short technical break before the meeting on enhancing technical cooperation and capacity building in promoting and protecting the human rights of persons in vulnerable and marginalized situations in recovery efforts during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.